All right, ladies and gentlemen, week 3 of the NFL season and the fantasy football season is in the books. And boy, oh boy, we got another week of big performances, big disappointment, and unfortunately, more injuries. So, you know what we need to do. We need to go through every single matchup, every single relevant player, and talk about who you need to sit and who you need to start for week 4 of the 2024 fantasy football season at the wide receiver position. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their week 4 Pick'ems are already going live, and Underdog is giving all new customers who sign up with promo code The Catch a free Dak Prescott over half of a total yard Pick'em to use towards Thursday night football. You can claim that by signing up with promo code The Catch. The link is down below. If you guys watch this video after Thursday night football, don't worry, you're going to get a free Lamar Jackson over half of a total yard to use towards Sunday's slate of games. So that's a free pick 'em for this week's action when you sign up with promo code The Catch. Plus, all new Underdog users are also going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up with promo code The Catch. Okay, let's kick things off with Thursday night football. We're going to have the Cowboys traveling to face the Giants. So, not too crazy of an evaluation here. We got one start, one flex option, and one sit for me for each team as we move into week 4. CeeDee Lamb, a disappointing week 3 against the Baltimore Ravens, a good game script. Pretty good matchup here. The Ravens defense really hasn't been that intimidating this season. Walked away with 7 targets, 4 receptions, 67 receiving yards, and 8.7 fantasy points. You definitely would like to see more out of a top 3 selection in most fantasy drafts this previous offseason. But nonetheless, CeeDee Lamb, week in, week out, you are starting him. Still got you double digits in each of the first 2 games of the season. I know this Cowboys team kind of in shambles, but at least we saw some life from the offense and actually a stout performance from quarterback Dak Prescott in that week 3 matchup. So CeeDee Lamb, disappointing, had the fumble, all that stuff, or he probably would have walked away with double digits depending on your scoring format. So Lamb, let's not overthink it. We are still starting him. Let's take a look at the wide receiver 2 and the wide receiver 3 for the Cowboys, though. I've got Brandon Cooks as a sit. I just, he's kind of been in that flex category. You know what you get out of Brandon Cooks. There's a lot of risk. There is upside, but he basically just feels like a touchdown or bust wide receiver. And, this is a good matchup against the Giants here in week 4. So, maybe if you're desperate, you could throw Cooks out there, but I just have no confidence in Brandon Cooks. Now, if you go back to last week's video for week 3, told you guys that I liked Jalen Tolbert as a potential flex option if you were hurting at the position, and he came through again, 14.2 points in week 2, but then showed up again in week 3 with a touchdown and 13.2 fantasy points. Now, game script helped him. I don't know what this game script against the Giants is exactly going to look like. They've looked better offensively in the past 2 games than they did in week 1. I don't know. Thursday night football always makes me a little bit shaky, but Jalen Tolbert, I think if you're in a bad enough position and you need someone to throw in the flex, I think Jalen Tolbert against the Giants is okay. He got a double-digit mark in week 2 with no touchdown and then hit the touchdown last week and got you double digits again. So I like Tolbert right now, but I'm not going to go out of my way necessarily to put him in my starting lineup. Moving along, we got the Giants, and Malik Nabers is balling out, man. So Malik Nabers was essentially my must-start wide receiver of week 2 going up against that Washington Commanders secondary. That's the worst in the entire league, and he came through with 28.7 fantasy points after that nice, 11.6 in week 1 and a bad offensive performance against maybe the best defense in the league in the Minnesota Vikings. And then in week 3, Malik Nabers still a start for me against Cleveland, but I didn't particularly expect him to have 78 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns off of 8 receptions. And he looked fantastic in this week 3 game, was making all kinds of crazy catches on the sideline, all that stuff. So I mean, Malik Neighbors right now, if you were worried in the offseason because Daniel Jones was the quarterback throwing to Malik Neighbors, that was me. Don't I will admit, Daniel Jones has looked good the last 2 games. He hasn't turned the football over. He had a fumble in week 3, but it wasn't a lost fumble. But he's thrown for 2 touchdowns in each of the last 2 games, and he is targeting Malik Neighbors. 18 targets in week 2, 12 in week 3. Everything we need is there. At the time I'm recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played yet, and Malik Neighbors is the wide receiver 2 in all of fantasy football. See if Monday Night Football changes that. Regardless, he's a start. Let's move along. Okay, Randall Robinson was a player I left as a flex option last week. He hit a double-digit mark of 13.1 fantasy points, 8 targets, 7 receptions, 61 receiving yards in week 3. Still like Randall Robinson as a flex option. This Cowboys defense does not scare me whatsoever. Their pass defense is better than their run defense. On the road here, Thursday night, Randall Robinson, you're in a pinch. You can go ahead and throw him in the flex spot. Darius Slayton did suffer an injury this past week on his thumb. So it looks like from the reports that it's actually no structural damage there. But regardless, was anyone really going to start Darius Slayton this week? He's been a sit every single week. So we'll leave him as a sit and hope that he recovers quickly if you truly need Darius Slayton in your fantasy lineup. So there we go. Cowboys, Giants, pretty easy. Let's move along. So we have the Bengals traveling to face the Panthers. And once again, I have to record these videos Monday morning. So I don't know what has happened in Monday Night Football yet, but the Bengals have the best matchup possible. So I'm going to assume that Jamar Chase and T. Higgins have good games against the Commanders secondary. If they don't, I think you're probably still starting Jamar Chase and at least considering T. Higgins in the flex. But I'm going to make a wild call and say that they perform at least to standard against the Washington Commanders. We'll find out. You guys can roast me in the comments if that doesn't happen. Now, Yoshi, on the other hand, I have as a sit. I mean, he can definitely also come through against the Commanders. We saw him score 2 touchdowns in week 2. I just don't know if there's going to be enough targets here, enough volume. I'm kind of worried about like him and guys like Mike Gesicki at the tight end position with T. Higgins coming back. It's a good enough matchup here in week 3 that they could come through, but I don't know. We're going to have to see what Yoshi does in week 3. I'm going to leave him as a sit for now. Maybe I get that wrong. And then you got Jermaine Burton as well, who had that big catch in week 2. Maybe shows up in week 3, but I just don't think there's going to be enough volume for Jermaine Burton to be anything super fantasy relevance just yet. The potential's there, but for the most part, I know Jamar Chase has been disappointing, and I know T. Higgins hasn't played, which has been disappointing, but I think they're going to show up in week 3, and we can consider them as start-worthy options as we approach week 4. Now, Deontay Johnson, the Carolina Panthers, their savior is here, the Red Rifle himself. He's come in. The bad man is on the bench. Bryce Young. Sorry, apparently you are the bad man. But Deontay Johnson, who I was very high on in the offseason, wow. 26.2 fantasy points in week 3 with Dalton at quarterback. And he should have had another touchdown in this game. So 14 targets, 8 receptions, 122 receiving yards in a tutty. Deontay Johnson's got to be a start until further notice. And where you drafted him, like you're throwing him in at the flex. I mean, unless you're dealing with all the injuries, right? So Deontay Johnson, if you held on to him, you did not drop him, you're feeling great. He gets bumped up to a start. Now, Adam Thielen was balling out too. Had a great kind of first half of this game before he suffered that hamstring injury. So got him in the flex category with an asterisk. 5 targets, 3 receptions, 40 receiving yards, a touchdown, 13 fantasy points before he had to exit the game. So we just kind of got to see what happens with Adam Thielen in terms of his health and everything. He can definitely be a viable flex option this week if he is healthy, but hamstring injuries kind of worry me. Xavier Leggett went from 7 targets week 1 to 0 week 2 to 3 in week 3. So definitely if Adam Thielen doesn't play, maybe there's some more potential here for Xavier Leggett to step up, but we're going to have to see it first before we make any bold assumptions. Jonathan Mingo had 4 targets, but just 5 fantasy points, so I'm not going to consider him as an option. So for the most part, we're starting the primary wide receivers for the Bengals and the Panthers as we move along to week 4. All right, next up, we will have the Saints traveling to face the Falcons, and this should be a interesting game. We've got, the Saints coming off of kind of a sluggish game against the Eagles, and then we have got the Falcons coming off of a close game that turned out to be a loss against the Kansas City Chiefs. So last week I had Chris Olave as well as Rashid Shaheed as absolute must starts against the Eagles. And let's start with Chris Olave, who, the thesis proved true against this Eagles secondary. And I kept telling you guys, I think this might be the week that Chris Olave finally scores a touchdown this season. And thank God it happened. 6 targets, 6 receptions, 86 receiving yards, a touchdown, 20.6 fantasy points. If you traded for Chris Olave, you bought him low or you held on to him, you were feeling good. This is what we wanted to see. And he just has to remain a start based on draft capital. The Falcons kind of been up and down in terms of their defensive play, but they are allowing for pretty positive game scripts, at least they have in the last 2 weeks. So I like Chris Olave to remain a start. Now, after week 1, and even after week 2, as much as I liked Rashid Shaheed and still considered him a must start in week 3 against this Eagles secondary, I told you guys each and every week, be wary, because I've been on the Rashid Shaheed train before and it's a bumpy ride. And that proved true in week 3. 16.3 in week 1, 20.9 in week 2. Big old goose egg in week 3. 5 targets, no receptions. Should have had a touchdown in this game. Should have at least given us something. Was very close to doing so, but this is where I start to get a little wishy-washy on Rashid Shaheed, because part of my theory for week 3, on top of the matchup being phenomenal, was that this should be a competitive game script. The Eagles are going to fight back in this game. This is not the Panthers with Bryce Young at quarterback or whatever the Dallas Cowboys were in week 2. This is a good Eagles football team, however you want to look at it. And that happened. This was a back and forth game. It wasn't a super high scoring game, but the game script was there where the Saints needed to do something other than just hand the football off to Alvin Kamara or throw to, touchdowns to 2 different tight ends like they did in week 1. So everything was there. And Rashid Shaheed just 5 targets in this game, which is nothing new compared to the first 2 weeks, but his involvement just wasn't quite there. And the receptions definitely weren't there. So I'm still okay with Rashid Shaheed. I'm not going to panic. I still think this Saints offense is going to do plenty of good things. I'm not going to hit the panic button on all the Saints players by any stretch. Shaheed is still a good flex option, but this is what I was warning you guys of. I've been down this path before with my guy Rashid Shaheed, and it's not always great. So cautionary flex start after being bumped up to a must start last week. Let's pump the brakes a little bit. Okay. Looking at the Falcons, Drake London, a player after week 1. I told you guys, don't lose the faith. Drake London, one of my favorite calls in week 2 as a must-start player against Philadelphia at 17.4 fantasy points. Then the question was, is he going to repeat that against the Chiefs defense? And he showed up big time. 18.7 fantasy points, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 67 receiving yards, a touchdown, 11.17 yards per catch, his best mark in that category on the season so far. But also, the important thing, I think, for the Falcons is you're starting to see this offense just gel a little bit more. The chemistry between Cousins and London, Cousins and Mooney come to life a little bit more. And this is a good of a opportunity to see what we're going to get out of the Falcons that we might get it all season against the Chiefs in week 3, right? So I liked a lot of what I saw out of this Falcons offense in week 3 and Kirk Cousins and the connection between Cousins and London. So London remains in that start category, even against a good Saints defense. But Darnell Mooney is the other kind of bright spot here. At the time of recording this, he sits at 43% roster. And I think part of the issue after week 2 was like, yeah, Mooney had a big game, but do you feel a little bit cautionary because this was against the Eagles secondary, And if you take away that big touchdown, then he had a really bad game. But man, he had 8 targets, 8 receptions, 66 receiving yards, no touchdown, and still 14.6 fantasy points in week 3. So once again, that chemistry between Cousins and Mooney looks very sharp, and he's got to remain a viable flex option if he's out there on the waiver wire, especially in full PPR. Mooney is a priority pickup going into week 4. Okay. Ray McLeod has been involved. We've seen his target share go down each week. Maybe in like a 16-man league. you are dealing with a mound of injuries, you could throw him out there, but he hasn't hit more than 9.2 fantasy points on the season, and his fantasy points have gone down every week. So he's a sit for me, but we're starting our studs in this game, and that's about it. Let's move along. All right, next up, we have the Jaguars traveling to face the Texans. And once again, a reminder, I'm sorry, I have to record these on Monday before Monday Night Football has been played. So don't know how the Jaguars are going to look tonight, but my assumption is that Brian Thomas Jr. is going to continue to be a safe start. They are facing a good Bills secondary, but unless Christian Kirk or Gabe Davis does something massive in this game, really the only wide receiver at the moment that I trust in this Jags offense is Brian Thomas Jr. So Christian Kirk's been a huge disappointment. I hope he changes that sooner rather than later. And Gabe Davis just way too volatile and really hasn't shown us a ceiling this season yet. Once again, maybe those things change on Monday Night Football, but I'm really Brian Thomas Jr. as a start, everyone else as a sit. Cross my fingers for no injuries to any of those players. Okay, the Texans wide receivers. Week in and week out. Told you guys that for me, you drafted Collins, you drafted Diggs, or you drafted Tank Dell. You're starting them, whether they're your wide receiver one or whether you have Tank Dell in the flex. You just continue to start these guys. And that was my thesis still going into week 3, even against a good Vikings defense. And I got comments last week like, Tank Dell, are you serious? No way we can trust him. But he showed up finally. 11.2 fantasy points. But I will say Tank Dell is dealing with 2 separate injuries. He has an injury to his wrist/hand and then a rib injury as well. So keep an eye on Tank Dell. He might not play in week 4. We'll have to kind of see what his status is throughout the week. So Robert Woods got 2 targets, 2 receptions in week 3. He might be a bigger part of the week 4 game plan, but I think for the most part here, you own Collins, you own Diggs, you keep starting them. That note, Diggs also showed up big time in week 3. And I kind of talked about this, like we might see a Diggs revenge game. I mean, he didn't score a touchdown, but 94 receiving yards off of 10 receptions and 12 targets was nice to see. And yeah, a little bit of a lower ceiling for Nico Collins, but he still got you double digits at 12.6 fantasy points. So the game script helped them, perform because they were playing from behind the whole game. But Collins, Dell, Diggs can all be considered starts as long as they're healthy on a week in, week out basis. If you drafted any of these guys, you knew you're going to get some volatility because all 3 of these guys can show up and have big performances. So for the most part, we'll see what happens with the Jags, but I think I'm just sticking with Brian Thomas Jr. for now. Then he can roll out the Texans wide receivers when you have them and they are healthy and available. All right, let's move along to the Broncos traveling to face the Jets. And Courtland Sutton finally had a good fantasy performance. And overall, the Broncos offensively finally had a good day. Courtland Sutton, 13.8 fantasy points, 11 targets, 7 receptions, 68 receiving yards. For what it's worth, he also had 12 targets in week 1. So I was very low on the Broncos passing attack going into week 3. And I don't quite know that even if some of these guys showed up in week 3, that I'm going to be high on them against the Jets, who looked very stout in week 3 defensively. So I just have everyone here in the sit category. So Lil Jordan Humphrey has had 9 or more fantasy points in the past 2 weeks. Josh Reynolds had 13.3 in week 2, but just 5.6 this past week. Marvin Mims has done essentially nothing this season, and then Sutton has had the highest volume and the most targets. But are we going to trust any Broncos wide receiver against the Jets right now? The answer is no. I know we saw some good things out of Bo Nix, the quarterback position. Nice to see, but is it going to happen on the road against the Jets? My guess is no, so I don't think anyone really needed to start any of those Broncos wide receivers. But maybe in a deep enough league, you had to consider like a Courtland Sutton. My answer is no for the week. Let's move along to the Jets. Garrett Wilson, we finally got a touchdown in week 3, but we're still getting a low ceiling. He's had 12 points, 10.2, and 14.3. We're not really getting the ceiling that we wanted out of a Aaron Rodgers to Garrett Wilson connection, but you got to keep Wilson as a start. At least the floor is safe. And hopefully as the season goes on, we just see this chemistry start to build and hopefully improve. And the red zone has been the biggest issue so far on the season. But Garrett Wilson, he's a safe start, even against a cornerback like Pat Surtain. If you have fears of starting him against Pat Surtain, I get it, especially with what Surtain did against Mike Evans this past week, but I'll leave Garrett Wilson as a start. You really have to have a very stout roster to consider benching him, even in this tough matchup. Alan Lazard, I think I'm just going to have in like the flex category for the rest of the year. Like, I'm not going to go out of my way to start Alan Lazard, but at the time I'm recording this, he's a top 12 wide receiver in fantasy football right now. So he's ahead of Garrett Wilson on the season. But, 3 touchdowns through 3 weeks, a bad performance in week 2. He's just a volatile flex option, 13.8 points in week 3. What you're getting. You've got a floor of 3.1 points like we saw in week 2 and a ceiling of 26.9 like we saw in week 1. So volatile flex option. We'll leave it at that. Mike Williams saw a little bit more involvement in week 3 as he comes along back from injury. 4 targets, 3 receptions, 6.4 fantasy points, 34 receiving yards. I'm not quite there with Mike Williams. I don't think he even needs to be rostered, but if you're continuing to stash him, it is encouraging to see more targets in week 3, maybe week 4, and more involvement in this offense. I will say the Jets offense starting to open up a little bit more. That's good. Played well against the Patriots defense that played good through the first 2 weeks of the season and made them look like an embarrassment in week 3. So positive things if you own Mike Williams or Alan Lazard, even Garrett Wilson. So we'll see what happens, but this one should be pretty straightforward. Let's set the Broncos and let's at least start Garrett Wilson moving into week 4. Along, we have the Vikings traveling to face the Packers. This one's a little bit tough to evaluate at the time I'm filming this because we don't know the status of Jordan Love for the week, but nonetheless, let's start with the Vikings. Justin Jefferson's been one of the best wide receivers in all of fantasy football. If you fell back in your draft, this fear of Sam Darnold at quarterback has not been an issue. Anyone who argued JJ was fine with Nick Mullins last year at the end of the year has always been fine as long as he's healthy was correct. Justin Jefferson's a wide receiver 3 in fantasy, has scored a touchdown each game. A little bit this Packers secondary has been playing well as of late, but man, come on, no more discussion. We're not even in any format, even in a 2-team format against your mom, you're still starting JJ. The other 2 wide receivers for the Vikings, we don't know if Jordan Addison's going to play this week. He almost played in week 3, so he's considered day-to-day. I think he's got a good shot to play in week 4. We'll just see what happens. I think Jordan Addison, my thesis going into week 3, was that Jordan Addison was a good start. If he was healthy and did enough playing, I honestly thought he was going to play, and then he didn't. So, I still like Addison going into week 4, even in a tough matchup. Jalen Naylor was a player I told you guys last week, you're desperate, throw Naylor in the flex. I said the same thing in week 2, and he's made the last-minute waiver wire video 2 weeks in a row, and I think he's going to continue to climb up in roster percentage. And I think even if Addison's healthy, that Jalen Naylor can continue to be a big part of this offense. This is a pass-first offense. This is a Kevin O'Connell offense. And I think Naylor's just going to continue to have a good role in this offense as long as he's healthy, regardless of Addison's health or not. So Naylor, at the time of recording this, a top 20 wide receiver in fantasy football. Keep rolling him out in the flex if you don't have any better options. Moving along to the Packers. Like I said, I don't know the status of Jordan Love's health. So almost supposedly played in week 3. It's a tough matchup for the Packers, even at home. This Vikings team, literally looks like the best team in the NFL. So, listen, it's tough to evaluate. Jaden Reed walked away with 10 fantasy points in week 3. Christian Watson had 8.7. Romeo Doubs had 2.8. He really relies on that chemistry with Jordan Love. And then Dontavion Wicks, after having a touchdown in 11.6 in week 2, had 0 in week 3. So, if Jordan Love plays, you can basically roll out just about any of these guys and just know what to expect. The highest ceiling with Reed, the most volatility with Watson, and probably a safe floor with Dobbs if Love plays. Then Wicks is just completely up in the air. So they kind of all get the asterisk and they all have a sit. It is a bad matchup regardless. And Malik Willis improved at the quarterback position this past week and was fine enough in week 2, although negatively impact the wide receivers in week 2. So maybe we see things open up even more, but I just don't know against this Vikings defense. if Malik Willis is the quarterback, then I'm comfortable starting the Packers wide receivers. I think at this point, if you own any of the Packers wide receivers, you're in a spot where you've moved to a different game plan and you're waiting for Jordan Love to come back anyways. So I'll leave them as a sit. Maybe if Jordan Love plays, we can upgrade them to that start category as we approach week 4. Let's move along to the Steelers traveling to face the Colts. And I don't feel so great about this matchup here, but let's take a look. Okay, George Pickens. Probably fine. I mean, I've had Pickens in the start category or like as a volatile flex every week. And so far, we got a ceiling of 13.5 points and a floor of 4.9. 10.7 points this past week against a good Chargers defense. I just don't know how high the ceiling is going to be for Pickens this year with Justin Fields at quarterback. And I mean, Fields is playing well, and this offense is starting to open up a bit more, but the game plan here isn't really benefiting George Pickens. And while I'm not, making any negative marks against Justin Fields, his style of play isn't really positively impacting George Pickens. But this Colts defense has been bad. Pickens is probably a player that you drafted to start in the flex, and he remains a flex option. But like I said, I just worry about the upside. And I think if you own George Pickens, you worry about the upside too. So it just kind of depends on what other options you have or don't have if you end up starting George Pickens or not. Calvin Austin made some waves in week 3, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 95 receiving yards, 23.7 yards per catch. Tutty, 19.5 fantasy points, but way too volatile here. I mean, very encouraging. This team needs a number 2 wide receiver. That's not a tight end and Pat Freiermuth. They need an actual wide receiver too. And Austin can be that guy. This was kind of the belief coming out of, his first year of college and coming into the league as a rookie, and then did essentially nothing last year. So we'll see what happens. Speedy guy. Not ready to start him in any fantasy matchups quite yet, though. Van Jefferson's injured, so he's a sit. Maybe he'll be healthy week 4, maybe not. I'm not starting him anyways. Scotty Miller, because Jefferson was hurt, saw some more involvement, but just 2 targets, 2 receptions, 5.1 fantasy points. Pickens the only guy that we can consider on this team in terms of the wide receiver position. All right, moving on to the Colts. Man, oh man, oh man. Told you guys last week, I was just worried about this whole Colts wide receiver room. There's plenty of reason to pick up Josh Downs off the waiver wire, but how did that impact or was going to impact the rest of Colts wide receivers? And Pittman's been in the start category, but at this point, I'm just sitting everybody. I mean, I got a really angry comment last week about not going out and picking up Josh Downs because the Colts wide receivers room is basically pointless because of Anthony Richardson's style of play. And looking back to last year when Downs was doing well and Pittman was doing well, is because of Gardner Minshew at quarterback. So maybe that's true. I mean, Richardson in the past 2 weeks has been very, very shaky. 5 interceptions, 1 passing touchdown, no rushing touchdowns, 17 of 34 and 10 of 20. I don't know what to do with this Colts wide receiver room right now. We can't trust Pittman. He's supposed to be the guy that we could trust. And he's gone with 7.1, 5.1, and 7.6 fantasy points. So this is also a really good Steelers defense. So, I mean, it's fine to hold Alec Pierce. It's fine to hold Josh Downs. Pierce still had a big catch last week. It just seems to happen. A.D. Mitchell is basically out of the game plan now. I just am going to sit everyone against the Steelers defense, and I hope you guys have a plan behind Michael Pittman because he's getting downgraded to a sit moving into week 4. Right, let's move along to the Rams traveling to face the Bears, and this was another team last week that I got an angry comment about, and the angry comment was why are you not picking up Jordan Whittington and starting him? He's going to be great and everything, and my thesis throughout the week on the Rams was the opportunity's here. It is a good matchup, but we're going to see way too much volatility to have any confidence in starting any Rams wide receiver this week. And I didn't really encourage you guys to start the Rams wide receivers last week unless you were absolutely desperate. And the only guy I really felt any comfort with was Demarcus Robinson. And that part didn't even come true. I mean, we've got in week 3, 4 targets to Robinson, 4.2 points, 3 targets to Whittington, 5.8 points, 5 to Atwell, who finished with 13.3 fantasy points because he had that long reception towards the end of the game. And then 4 targets to Tyler Johnson with 5 fantasy points. So I think we're going to get something similar this week. I mean, you're really relying on a touchdown. And Kyren Williams, if you're a Kyren Williams owner, I mean, this was basically like a doomsday scenario for Kyren Williams. Like, there's no one to really help push the football down the field. All your offensive line is hurt. And you know that the opposing defense knows if you get in the red zone that Sean McVay is going to try and run the football. And Kyren Williams said, I'm going to be your doomsday, and scored 3 touchdowns and helped the Rams get a victory, right? So I think Williams is going to continue to get a lot of volume. And I think that these wide receivers are just going to be touchdown or bust. I just don't know here. I don't have any confidence in starting any of these Rams wide receivers right now. It's not particularly a bad matchup or a good matchup against the Bears, but I just can't start these guys. They're all sits for me, unfortunately, moving into week 4. Moving along to the Bears. Had an interesting matchup in week 3 against the Colts, and we saw some overall improvement from the passing game for the Bears. And while there were still struggles, some overall improvements for Caleb Williams as well. And this benefited DJ Moore and Rome Odunze. So I don't want to overreact to what we saw in week 3, but this Rams secondary sucks. I mean, no other way of putting it. They are one of the worst in the league. And Jawan Jennings just had a hat trick against them. And there were multiple plays where Brandon Ayuk was wide open. I think we got to continue to roll with wide receivers playing against the Rams secondary. DJ Moore, his best mark of the season with 15.2 fantasy points in week 3. Rome Odunze, his best mark of the season with 23.4 in week 3. Roll these guys out there again. I mean, Keenan Allen's status is up in the air. He's been out the past 2 weeks. Keenan Allen had 11 targets in week 1, so maybe like Odunze, or I guess you could argue DJ Moore might see less targets if Allen plays, but until I see a real good stat line out of Keenan Allen, he's a sit for me. I mean, he had 11 targets week 1, but just 6.9 fantasy points. So, for me, DJ Moore, Rome Odunze, keep rolling them out there against this bad Rams secondary, and we'll see what happens. I think they're, both viable starters this week. Rome Odunze definitely closer to a flex option because still inconsistency overall in the year, but we'll go ahead and roll them out there again. And yeah, I'm just going to sit the Rams wide receivers moving into week 4. All right, let's move along to the Eagles traveling to face the Buccaneers. At the time we're recording this, A.J. Brown's health with that hamstring injury is still up in the air. And then now, unfortunately, Devonta Smith, after suffering a really unfortunate hard hit, is dealing with a concussion, and his health is up in the air. I mean, this team really needs that early week 5 bye week that they're getting because they need to get healthy at the wide receiver position. And you look at who's available here if Smith doesn't play. We got Paris Campbell, Brenton Covey, Johnny Wilson, and Jahan Dotson. I don't feel good about starting any of these guys. And Brenton Covey got hurt in week 3 too. I mean, he showed a little bit of light in week 2 with 6 targets, 6 receptions. And now he's dealing with a shoulder injury. So he should really have an asterisk next to his name on the screen there. But I don't think you guys were considering starting him anyways. Campbell had 2 targets in week 3. Dotson had 3 targets. I just don't think these guys are going to get it done. And I mean, Johnny Wilson does 2 targets as well. So we might really be looking at a week 4 matchup where Campbell, Smith, and Dotson are your starters. And I just don't feel good about that whatsoever, and I think you guys agree. So let's cross our fingers to see A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith make speedy recoveries and get back out on the field, and they could very well both rest through that week 5 bye week. I don't think that's out of the question. Buccaneers, on the other hand, get a great matchup this week against that Eagles secondary that was better, give them credit, better in week 3 against the Saints, but still not great. So we're still starting our primary wide receivers against the Eagles secondary. And I think the big thing here to really look at is, a bad week out of Mike Evans in week 3 and not a great week in week 2. Week 3 got the Pat Surtain treatment. For me, it was still a start. Like, I think you still got to start your studs against stud cornerbacks because a lot of stud wide receivers still show up, but that did not happen. 3 targets, 2 receptions, 17 receiving yards, 3.7 fantasy points. Now, Chris Godwin may have fell back a little bit in the overall rankings, but he's still a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy football at the time of recording this and has a touchdown in every single game this year. 17.3 fantasy points in week 3. Beautiful matchup for Godwin. He stays in your lineup no matter what. And Evans against this Eagles secondary. Once again, we're starting Mike Evans. We're starting Chris Godwin. Jalen McMillan showed that promise in week 1. He's a stash, and that's it. He doesn't even offer any flex capability. I mean, maybe in a matchup like this, if you're really desperate, like a super deep league, I guess. But he's had 3.1 and 1.6 in the last 2 weeks after that touchdown and 10.2 in week 1. We're not touching Jalen McMillan anytime soon. So let's hope the Eagles receivers get healthy sooner rather than later. And let's start our stud wide receivers for the Bucs in week 4. Let's move along to the Patriots traveling to face the San Francisco 49ers. And man, I've still got everyone here as a sit for the Patriots, but saw a little bit of life out of Demario Douglas in week 3. 9 targets, 7 receptions, 69 receiving yards, 14.8 fantasy points. My viewpoint is still that Demario Douglas is the most talented wide receiver on this Patriots team, and he should be more involved, but we'll see if that comes true or not. I mean, he did not hardly get any involvement. I mean, 3 targets through the first 2 weeks of the season. So this is a bad Niners secondary. This defense for the Niners right now is not playing well. Front 7 still, has some studs, but especially the secondary has not been playing well. And the run defense even has not been playing that great. So maybe if you're desperate enough, you could roll Demario Douglas out, but I haven't seen enough of a consistent stat line to want to start Demario Douglas. Jalen Polk's your next guy up, I guess. 2 targets. I mean, Osborne had 0 targets in week 3. Keyshawn Boutte had 2 targets. Tyquan Thornton had 1 target. I mean, come on. We're not starting any of these guys. You'd have to be overly desperate to even consider starting Demario Douglas. Let's move along. All right. The Niners. This is going to be interesting. We've got our MVP of the season and Jawan Jennings with the hat trick and a monster performance against the Rams. 46.5 fantasy points. 12 targets, 11 receptions, 175 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns, 15.9 yards per catch. Oh my goodness gracious. Jawan Jennings will go down in history. I mean, this might be the best fantasy performance of the whole year. And like I said earlier in the video, Brandon Ayuk was like wide open a couple of times in this game. But let's just rewind for a second. If Debo plays, you still start him. Debo might be out for this game again, though. So let's just leave it at that. Debo plays, you start him. He's a stud. We know that. Ayuk, still disappointing in such a good matchup. And I mean, there you rewind some of the plays, right? Ayuk was wide open. There's one where he threw it to Jennings for no reason. Ayuk is headed to glory days with just wide open, could have scored on a huge touchdown, but whatever was happening between Purdy and Jennings almost felt personal in week 3. Disappointing out of Ayuk. He's still a start for me. I'm going to give Ayuk one more shot in week 4, maybe week 5 against the Cardinals before I start to panic and say Ayuk just gets booted to the bench. And if you have players that you want to start over Ayuk at this point, sure, that's fine. But for the most part, for me, Ayuk is still a start, and we'll see what happens. Now, Jawan Jennings becomes really interesting because, he still had 11.4 fantasy points in week 1, just 5.7 in week 2, but that was against the Vikings on the road. Then obviously we're not going to get 46.5 fantasy points. We're not going to have that as an expectation, but now we're kind of somewhere in the middle. The crazy thing is, the time of recording this, he's the wide receiver 1 in fantasy football. and that week 1 performance is helping him because you still look at some guys out there like Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors. Like we have some names of guys who've had some a little bit more consistency here, and Jennings is still beating them out. So I think Jennings is going to be a viable starter for most of the season, regardless of Debo's health or Brandon Ayuk's play. I just don't quite know what the floor and ceiling is. So he's got to be a start. How do I not call him a start after last week, regardless of if Debo's healthy or not? So the Patriots have been a little bit up and down defensively. It's a home game for the Niners. Niners need a win. I mean, they're 1-2 on the season. So Pats looked bad last week. Fire up your Niners wide receivers. Let's see what we get out of Jawan Jennings again here in week 4. All right, next up we have the Commanders traveling to face the Cardinals. Once again, reminder, I have to record these on Mondays early, so I don't know what's happened to Monday Night Football yet. Maybe McLaurin has a big week. Maybe he doesn't. I still am kind of very worried about Terry McLaurin, and I hope things look different this week against the Bengals, but I just don't know if McLaurin's going to be more than a flex and a volatile flex at that. He just makes me so nervous with, kind of this system that they've put together for Jaden Daniels. And then in the red zone, they're really just running the football. And, Daniels overall while he did throw more in week 2 than week 1, he's had 10 plus rushing attempts through the first 2 weeks. So I just have McLaurin as a volatile flex. It's the best I can do. It is a good matchup in week 4 against the Cardinals. So I always drop a comment down below and pin it, kind of recapping how I feel about Monday Night Football players in the comments. So you can refer to that if McLaurin gets hurt or has a monster game. We can reevaluate here. But I'm worried about Terry McLaurin. Hope that changes. Now, everyone else, Luke McCaffrey, Browns, Achias, just sit all these guys. They'd have to have a Jawan Jennings-like performance for me to want to start any other Washington Commanders wide receiver in any capacity moving into the week. On the other hand, for the Cardinals, Marvin Harrison Jr. continues to be a very solid start. Another touchdown in week 3. Made the must-start video for week 2 and week 3 here on the channel. And he'll probably make it again in week 4. I mean, this stretch of the Rams, the Lions, and the Commanders has just been beautiful for Marvin Harrison Jr. And I'm already calling that it's going to be beautiful in week 4 against the Commanders. So go ahead and continue to fire up Marvin Harrison Jr. as a start-worthy option. Now, I do have Michael Wilson as a sit, and he finished with 14.4 fantasy points against a poor Detroit Lions secondary. Now he gets the Commanders secondary. So maybe that was a little bit too harsh. I just don't know if I trust Michael Wilson. A touchdown week 1, 7.5 points, 5.1 points in week 2, then 14.4 off of 9 targets, 8 receptions, 64 receiving yards in this past week. I just don't know. It's a little volatile. It is a really good matchup. If you're desperate, sure, you could throw Michael Wilson out there, but I don't know. I just don't feel that great. I mean, it kind of goes back to like Greg Dortch, very volatile. 11.1, 3.1, 6.5. Looked like he might be the true wide receiver 2 on this team after week 1, and then has 8 combined targets in the next 2 weeks after having 8 targets in week 1. So I just don't know. I think maybe I feel more comfortable with Michael Wilson if you're desperate, but I don't feel great here, even in a good matchup. If this wasn't a good matchup, I'd just say, yeah, for sure, sit them both. But maybe Michael Wilson, if you're struggling, you could throw out there in the flex just because of the matchup. But Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to continue to eat up these targets and be the wide receiver to start for the Cardinals until further notice. All right, let's move along to the Chiefs. 3-0. Traveling to face the Chargers. So this is going to be an interesting one. Let's start with the Chiefs here. Rashee Rice, at the time recording this, is your wide receiver 5 in fantasy football. He's a start on a week in, week out basis. A guy that I'm very passionate about drafting in the offseason, going all the way back to like the spring, telling you guys, you got to draft Rashee Rice. He's a bargain, and all offseason long, he remained a bargain, even as he raised an ADP. But this is Patrick Mahomes' number 1 option, his number 1 read. The chemistry's been great. We've seen a touchdown in the last 2 games, 17.3 or more fantasy points in every game this year. Rashee Rice is going nowhere near your bench. He's a start no matter what. Xavier Worthy, I've had it as a flex the last 2 weeks and just told you guys, Like, we know the ceiling's over 20 fantasy points. We know the floor is probably low. And, against this Chargers defense in week 4, I just don't feel good about Xavier Worthy. I don't. That's the problem, right? Like, it's so volatile. And we haven't really seen an increase in targets, 3, 4, and 4 in the past 3 weeks. So he's touchdown or bust, and it worked against the Ravens, and it might work here in week 4. It might work in week 5 or some other time this season. We'll probably see Worthy score. But this past week, it should have made more sense against the Falcons because we have the injury to Isaiah Pacheco, and Worthy just didn't really get any added involvement. So he's got to be a sit for me against the Chargers defense. You'd have to be really desperate and just crossing your fingers for a touchdown. Now, we did see a touchdown from Juju Smith-Schuster. He actually had less targets than Xavier Worthy at 3 targets, 2 receptions, 17 receiving yards, and a touchdown, 9.7 fantasy points. But other than that, he's had 1 target on the season. We're not considering starting Juju anytime soon. Looking at the Chargers, this is going to be interesting because we've had some up and down reporting about Justin Herbert's ankle. So we know he re-aggravated that ankle sprain in week 3 against the Chargers. Right now, the report is that he's had negative x-rays, which I guess is good. Been in and out of a walking boot. He had the foot injury in the offseason. I don't really like the way the situation's looking for the Chargers. They have a bye week in week 5. I think there's a high likelihood that Herbert doesn't play this week, which I thought in week 3 would lead us to Easton Stick, but it actually led us to Taylor Heineke. Now, what does that mean for the wide receivers? I like Quentin Johnston as a start, gets upgraded from the flex to the start if Justin Herbert plays. And really, you should see an asterisk next to Ladd McConkey's name because I only like Ladd as a flex if Justin Herbert plays, and he's a risky flex at that, a volatile flex. So I don't know. I just don't know at the time recording this. If Herbert plays, sure, you could start Quentin Johnston at that point. We've seen enough out of the question's not about Quentin Johnston. It's just about the quarterback play. Because I think even if Herbert plays, like, how high is the likelihood that he gets re-injured again with Chris Jones in the middle of that defensive line? So Quentin Johnston's your wide receiver 12 at the time recording this. The chemistry between him and Herbert's been real. 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games, both games on the road. So I like Johnson enough this week, but I don't know how I feel if Herbert's not the quarterback. I'm probably going to sit him and Ladd McConkey, and I'm not even really crazy about Ladd McConkey in the flex. Very volatile flex if you're very desperate. You should really, honestly, probably be a sit, but I labeled him as a flex, so we're just going to leave it. But yeah, this is going to depend on Justin Herbert's play. And we'll see what happens, but I'm very shaky on the Chargers offense going into week 4. All right, let's move along to the Browns traveling to face the Raiders. This will be an interesting matchup as well. Deshaun Watson, another struggle in week 3, but he still threw 2 touchdowns, and they both went to Amari Cooper. And Amari Cooper was a player that I encourage you guys throughout the week, like, give Cooper one last chance here. Don't bench him against the Giants at home. The targets had been there through the first 2 weeks, and he showed up big time in week 3. 12 targets, 7 receptions, 86 receiving yards, 12.2 yards per catch. Like I mentioned, those 2 receiving touchdowns, then 27.6 fantasy points. Great matchup this week against the Raiders. Great matchup next week against the Commanders. And a great matchup the following week after the Eagles. Keep Cooper in your starting lineups. He is questionable at the time of recording this. We'll see what happens if he's healthy. We're playing him. Jerry Jeudy, I thought, would also perform better in this game, or at least as he had been performing. But he kind of lowered that ceiling down to 8.7 fantasy points. So Judy's a guy you can throw out there in the flex, hit 11.5 and 12.3 in the first 2 weeks. He's a flex option with the matchups this team has coming up in terms of the secondaries in the next couple of weeks, but nothing more than that. Not particularly going out of my way to start him. Now, Elijah Moore, 3 targets week 3. Cedric Tillman, 2 targets week 3. Good matches for these guys, but we're not considering starting them. The volume has just not been there yet. Moving on to the Raiders. I thought that Devontae Adams would have a better game in week 3 against the Panthers. And he had his worst performance of the season yet. 8 fantasy points, 9 targets, 4 receptions, 40 receiving yards, 10 yards per catch. That part was good, but Minshew struggled in that game against Carolina. They looked unprepared. Andy Dalton slinging it out there. Adams will be fine, though. I mean, we got to keep rolling Adams out there. We'll see what happens against this Browns defense, but I mean, I don't think anyone's really going to end up benching Adams anytime soon. He still was very good through the first 2 weeks of the season. Now, Jacoby Myers had a big week in week 3. He was the one who showed up against the Panthers, but a lot of it was in garbage time. He did have 21.2 fantasy points. I don't want to ignore that, but I'm just not there. You'd have to be desperation start to throw Jacoby Myers out there in the flex. And I mean, Trey Tucker had a big game too. I mean, he led the team in receiving, but he had a combined 5 targets before week 3. I mean, he had over 21 fantasy points for Myers and Tucker. Don't get me wrong. There's flashes here. Are you really going to start them in your starting lineup against the Browns in week 4? I don't think so. Certainly keep an eye on both players, all that good stuff. But just not enough there for me to want to start either Myers or Tucker as we approach week 4. Move along to the Bills traveling to face the Ravens. Last reminder, I record these on Mondays before Monday Night Football plays. The only way I can get these videos out in time for you guys. Don't know how the Bills wide receiver room is going to look tonight, but I think that Khalil Shakir is going to continue to be a viable start, not a high ceiling. Maybe he has a down week. He's probably still fine against a Ravens defense that looks very uninspired as of late. So home game for the Ravens. We'll see what happens, but I'll start Khalil Shakir, low ceiling play, probably fine floor, and we'll have to see what we get out of Coleman or Curtis Samuel in week 3. But I don't like my chances there. They're probably going to stay as sits. Keep an eye on both of them, especially Coleman. He's been very up and down through the first couple weeks of the season. We'll just leave Shakir as a start and go from there. All right, moving on to the Ravens. Zay Flowers a down week in week 3. Game script was there. I mean, we've really seen the offense funnel through Zay Flowers the first 2 weeks of the season. And against this Dallas Cowboys run defense, the Ravens just said, we're just going to run the football down their throats. 25 rushing attempts to Derrick Henry, and Lamar Jackson ran the football 14 times. He only threw the ball 15 times. So, I mean, we did see more involvement from guys like Rashad Bateman in this game. And, Nelson Aguilar still just had 1 catch because that's what he does. And Devontae Walker was inactive. He's still dealing with an injury. He hasn't really done anything whatsoever in his rookie season. So, I mean, Bateman, even though he scored a touchdown, is still not an option for me. And Aguilar, definitely not an option. But with all that being said, I mean, you still only saw a combined 5 targets for those 2 wide receivers. And although Flowers had just 4 targets in week 3, even in a tough matchup against a good Bills secondary, we know that Zay Flowers is the primary pass catcher on this team. It's not Mark Andrews. And unfortunately, if you spent half your free agent bidding on Isaiah Likely after week 1, it ain't Isaiah Likely either. It might actually be Justice Hill, quite frankly. So Flowers, all in all, is still a solid start. I don't think that the Ravens will be able to run as wild as they did against the Cowboys, the run defense in the NFL, as they're potentially going to be able to against the Bills in week 4. So Flowers, still a start. Don't panic. We got to have him in our starting lineups moving into week 4. Moving along, we're going to take a look at the Titans traveling to face the Dolphins. So this one's a bit of a head scratcher. Let's just start with the Titans. DeAndre Hopkins had less than 4 fantasy points the first 2 weeks of the season. Then showed up in week 3. 7 targets, 6 receptions, 73 receiving yards, a tutty, 19.3 fantasy points. Calvin Ridley, 8 fantasy points week 1, 24.7 week 2, 1.9 in week 3. So that Packers secondary's been playing well. Held Calvin Ridley down. D-Hop got a little bit loose. Will Levis has still been bad. He did throw 2 touchdowns in week 3. He also threw 2 picks, and he had another lost fumble. He's had a lost fumble and at least 1 interception. in every game this year, 2 interceptions in 2 games. So, like, even against a Dolphins team that's a little bit depleted right now, this Dolphins defense has been playing okay. Like, their secondary is better than their run defense. So, I guess Hopkins or Ridley are still flex options, but I don't feel like I put an asterisk next to their name because I just don't have confidence in either of them. Like, you have to be in a position where you have to start D Hop or start Ridley. And Ridley's kind of bounced back and forth for me, like a flex, a start. It's just with Will Levis at quarterback, I don't know what to expect out of the Titans on a week in, week out basis. So you own D Hop, you own Ridley. There's nothing else on your bench. Sure, I guess. Tyler Boyd's a sit. No more than 6.3 fantasy points in a game this year. He's a sit for me. Pretty easy. Now, the Dolphins is the real head scratcher. I don't know why I'm literally scratching my head, but I think everyone's panic meter on the Dolphins has skyrocketed here. And really, we're just looking at Hill and Waddle, who are unfortunately both drafted in the first 3 rounds of your draft. Skylar Thompson's hurt, dealing with a rib injury. Might play, might not play week 4. It was already bad enough with Thompson playing and 2 on IR. Now we're going to get Tim Boyle, or we're going to get maybe Tyler Huntley, who is signed with the Dolphins to their practice squad, or maybe they go out and sign someone else, like Mike White or Ryan Tannehill. I don't know. But I think that Hill, who I was okay starting last week, gets downgraded to a flex till the time being. Waddle is for sure in the flex category. I mean, Hill 7 points week 3, Waddle 6.6. Waddle was downgraded to flex last week, and quite frankly, they get an asterisk also because they're only flex worthy, similar to Hopkins and Ridley, unless there's nothing else there. And we're basically hoping for a garbage time touchdown. Like with Tyreek Hill last week, I was just hoping at the end of that game that Tim Boyle was going to throw a touchdown to Tyreek Hill when they were down in the red zone. It didn't happen. I mean, I'm very worried about these Dolphins wide receivers. You can call them sits if you want to, but if you're desperate enough, at home, sure, we could flex Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle, and if Tua doesn't play football again, I totally respect that. But from a pure fantasy perspective, I think we're a little hopeful that Tua comes back from IR. If he doesn't, so be it. But man, if he doesn't, I don't think we're going to really start any Dolphins wide receivers, even Tyreek Hill, anytime soon in fantasy football. Final matchup of week 4, we've got the Seahawks traveling to face the Lions. This should be a good matchup. Let's start with the Seahawks, and DK Metcalf every single week has been a start because what else are you supposed to do with DK Metcalf? You just start him week in, week out. Okay. Bad matchup week 1 against the Broncos, 5.9 fantasy points. Outside of that, a touchdown in week 2, touchdown in week 3, 20 or more fantasy points. Another good game in week 3 with 104 receiving yards off of 4 receptions and 6 targets. Tutty, like I said, 20.4 fantasy points. Great matchup for Metcalf. Probably going to be one of the must-start players of the week against this Lions secondary that just continues to look bad. JSN went from 16 targets, 12 receptions, and 23.7 fantasy points in week 2 to 3 fantasy points in week 3. So JSN I had as a flex last week. I think I had Lockett as a sit. Lockett did better in week 3 than JSN. Listen, I put them both down as flexes. I think between Jackson Smith and Jigba and Tyler Lockett, like, you just know what you're getting. It's a very volatile play. You might get 13.7 fantasy points like Lockett gave you in week 1. You might get 23.7 like JSN gave you in week 2. Or you might see their floor, which is 3.9 for JSN and 3.5 for Lockett. So it's a good matchup this week. So I think either of them could pop. But do I fully trust either player? Probably not. It's going to be my answer. But you can certainly still start both of them, especially due to the matchup. But we've seen volatility out of both of those wide receivers thus far on the season. All right, let's move along to the Lions. Amon-Ra St. Brown, doesn't matter what the matchup is. He's a week in, week out starter. We don't really need to cover him. Another big performance. After week 1, I was like, if you guys can trade for Amon-Ra St. Brown, trade for Amon-Ra St. Brown, because this is not going to be the norm 4.3, 22.9, 20.5. Those are his marks on the season. Saw his first touchdown against the Cardinals in week 3. Seahawks have been pretty good defensively. We're still starting on Ross St. Brown. That brings us to the question of Jameson Williams, who made the must-start video in week 1, week 2, and week 3. Was showing up big time. Was a dud in week 3. 3 targets, 1 reception, 9 receiving yards. Goff was close on one of those passes to getting it to J-Mo for a touchdown on 3rd down, but didn't happen, and he was a total bust this week. But I think J-Mo continues to be a start for me, especially because Sam Laporta is a little banged up. Now, it's a low ankle sprain for Laporta. He might still play week 4. He might rest because the Lions have a week 5 bye week. We'll find out. If Laporta doesn't play, that's obviously a good thing for Jameson Williams, who for the most part on the season has still been taking all of Sam Laporta's targets, it feels like. So J-Mo, I'm not going to panic quite yet. If you want to kind of downgrade him to more of like a flex option, sure, fine. Whatever, I get it. Very bad performance in week 3, very disappointing. But I think we're going to see a good competitive game script here in week 4. J-Mo, I'm still good with starting, even if you downgrade him. And Amon-Ra, Metcalf, beautiful starts. JSN Lockett, decent flex starts due to matchup as we move in to week 4. And that'll do it for today's video. There's every player, every matchup, all your start sits for the wide receiver position as we approach the week. Don't forget, guys, I will answer every fantasy football question in the comment section on today's video. If you guys have any questions whatsoever as we approach week 4 of the 2024 fantasy football season, please drop them down below. I'll get to every question before Thursday Night Football and then again before Sunday's slate of games. And don't forget, guys, as the week goes on, I'll have all of our videos linked down below. Start sits at running back, start sits at quarterback and tight end, must start defenses, must start kickers, waiver wire ads, last minute waiver wire ads, buy low options, must start running backs, must start wide receivers. Everything that you guys need for week 4 of the season will be going live on the channel. So make sure you guys are subscribed so you guys don't miss any of the content. And don't forget, we will be having our live fantasy Q&A streams throughout the week as well. So that'll do it for today's video. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.